Welcome to another edition of Carnivore Bites. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. A lot of financial information, a lot of information or news about the economy, especially inflation. It's now lower than expected, 5%. However, a recent poll, very recent poll, states that 70% of Americans are stressed about their financial situation and almost 60% living paycheck to paycheck. Your comments, Dr. Lopkin?
Yeah, inflation is really a mixed bag. I mean, the numbers were lower than expected. They were good. But I actually just had this conversation yesterday on our sister podcast, Raw Naked Truth, with Chris Calandra. The problem with the inflation numbers is that the numbers that are affecting the most people, especially lower income, are much higher than that broad number indicates. So while prices of computers, say, are coming down, that's not going to affect most people's day to day. They don't need to buy a new computer all the time. But food prices, which are up 30%, that's hitting the bottom line.
Okay, you
Well,
have beyond an amazingly good point. This kind of bullshit's been going on for years. I agree with you 100%. Even housing is part of the, let's just say, the market basket that they put into the equation. No, how come they don't haven't segmented that out? I'm talking. Well, there's no such thing as reporters anymore. But yeah, how many people? You buy a computer what every 3 years? You buy a house what every 30. So there's a real disconnect between you go to the grocery store. $100 is like a flash in the pan. It's a joke. You can piss that away and going down 2 aisles.
well, the housing number in inflation actually includes rentals, and that people paying rent every month, that's going up a lot faster than the the core inflation number. So that's affecting people. You're having people struggling to meet their rent. You're having people struggling to meet their food bills. You're actually this is not a new story, but we've seen for years, seniors especially, trying to make that decision. Do I cut back on my medication or do I cut back on my food? Because they're not making enough to cover both.
So what is the implications? This is a politically oriented podcast. What are the implications for political implications for this nationally in particular?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure there are any because we're usually, I would say, yes, people vote with their pocketbooks. What we just saw over the past several weeks in the Wisconsin Supreme Court elections, in several special elections around the country, people are ignoring all of the crime, all of the economic news, and they're actually voting on abortion rights.
Hmm. I think it had a big impact on the midterms not so long ago. I think
Yes.
you're 100% correct.
So
Isn't
I
that a
don't.
whole changing of the guard, though, in mentality or lack thereof in America? That it used to be people vote with their pocketbooks, but now as we become more of an emotionally driven society, emotional issues are playing a greater role in decisions,
It
political
is.
decisions.
It is, and it's a major problem because we're seeing people actually voting against their best interest. We just saw this in the Chicago mayoral election, where crime is the biggest issue, but they still voted in a soft on crime progressive mayor rather than a Democratic mayor that was going to fight crime. And the main thing that everybody's pointing to in that is because the progressive mayor did a massive ad campaign lying that his less progressive counterpart was pro life.
Well, isn't it indicative though of probably uninformed voting populace? I mean, you have light. They voted Lightfoot in. I mean, that should just disqualify them for future vote castings, you know, forever.
Well, I mean, the problem is we don't, you alluded to this earlier, we don't have reporters anymore.
No.
We've talked about the echo chamber problem for over a decade, and it's just getting worse. And people are getting their information off of Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, which most of the information on these platforms is incorrect. And you can check it yourself with a simple Google search, but most people don't. And it's not just politics that this is. um, this is a pet peeve of mine, but it drives me up the wall where nutritional information is posted primarily by vegans and vegetarians on Facebook. And if you just go to Google to check the facts, you see it's not even close to true. But people believe it.
Oh, people don't know. To your point, that with young people, very obviously influenced by TikTok and all, they were talking about the when Biden approved the drilling in Alaska. There was a lot of TikTok information that boggles the mind, but supposedly drilling there was more detrimental to the environment because it releases more, methane, which is totally untrue. But people believe it because they don't Google it after or don't do any research. And that's a bigger issue because when we, back in the Stone Age, when we were in school, you'd have a report to write. Was Abraham Lincoln a good president? Was George Washington an effective general? You'd actually have to read books or articles
Yes.
or opinion and formulate your own opinion. Now, students of all ages, you just Google it, and people basically don't know how to think.
And that's actually going to get worse now that we have more and more AI.
Exactly, 100%. Speaking of the AI, interesting enough, we alluded to this before, but this generation, talking about the young people today, you think they'd be having more sex than ever because it's so readily available online and all the rest of that. It's the least they're having the least real sex, but they've actually, and I think this is kind of sad, like just like with personal interactions, they've replaced real interpersonal reactions with virtual. Same thing with sex. There's a whole situation of people actually getting involved with virtual sex companions. When I say involved, I'm talking emotionally. Pretty, pretty twisted.
Yeah, I just saw, I don't remember where it was. There was a story, they interviewed someone that actually claims to have fallen in love with his virtual, and by virtual, let's face it, we're talking imaginary sex partner. I
Oh
mean,
yes,
this
no,
is
I saw that interview. He was a grown man too, and he basically, just like we all did when you break up with a girlfriend back in the day, you'd be all bummed out. This guy was bummed out, which shows you how far we've fallen from his virtual girlfriend. Very twisted.
yeah, it's really frightening. I mean, these virtual, the fact that somebody could imbue an emotional response to a computer. And I think, I mean, and let's face it, if you are in a quote unquote sexual situation with a virtual girlfriend, this, for you and I, this would have been the equivalent of being in a sexual relationship with an issue of Playboy.
There you
There's
go.
nothing on the other end. It's,
But it isn't a bigger issue that we've and it's been going. I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to know, or a sociologist. We're trading real human experiences for virtual. Even with young people, I'm not picking on them, but you look at like an old World War II video. I know this sounds a little out there, but it's true. You have the people loading kids, whatever, loading ammunition, whatever. They got a butt hanging out of their mouths, yet they're ripped. I'm talking physically. Kids today, what am I getting to? Is that they're trading real, like we used to toss the football outside, throw a baseball, whatever, to virtual stuff, and they can't even pass the physical requirements to get into the service.
Yeah, it really is frightening. And unfortunately, it's not unexpected. I don't remember who the comedian was, and this is going back to late '80s, early '90s, when virtual reality was first showing up. And the comedian said, "It's like, you know what? When somebody can put on a virtual headset and have sex with Christy Brinkley, we're basically society is going to come to an end." And
Well, we won't have to
this is
worry about overpopulation, the big fear of
this
the
is
70s. There you go.
this is
Um,
what's happening.
and on the humorous side, I don't think you could make this up if you were a stand up. Rodney Dangerfield couldn't do this. The Dems are having their convention in Chicago. That is precious.
Yes.
You go to the very place you've destroyed, which was once an amazing, maybe the most amazing American city, and now it's down the shitter with Philadelphia and the rest of them.
Well, it was a toss up between Chicago and San
It was
Francisco,
a
where,
toss of the coin. Yes. Who have we
but
destroyed? What city have we destroyed most? And they sided with Chicago because it's bigger.
you know what? I think it's indicative of a bigger problem. And that is that the Democrats truly do not seem to understand the damage they've done. The San Francisco Chronicle last week, and let's face it, the San Francisco Chronicle is as far as you can get from a conservative newspaper as there
Yes.
is. San Francisco Chronicle wrote an editorial that San Francisco is in a death spiral and they don't think they're going to be able to pull out of it because of the Democratic policies. And when you've got the San Francisco Chronicle ringing the bell about this, you would think Nancy Pelosi of all people would listen. But no,
Well, no, because no,
they're
no,
going
no,
to
because they are. You
showcase
talk
the
about the
damage.
echo chamber. They're in the echo chamber. There was a commentator talking about the decision to go to Chicago. It's not going to affect them because they're not living in the Chicago of the south side of Chicago. They're insulated. Nancy Pelosi's living right outside San Francisco, and in her little vineyard and having her townhouse that was broken into, by the way. But they don't have to. They don't have to deal. In their eyes, they're doing a heck of a job because they're reducing the carbon footprint because more
See, but
people are
even
leaving California.
this is beyond an echo chamber problem, though, because especially in San Francisco, Chicago, the problem is limited to low income neighborhoods. So yes, the wealthy Democrats who are in office, they're not affected by it. San Francisco, however, is different. Bob Lee, who's the CEO of Cash App, I'm sure most of our listeners have heard about his murder. His murder happened in a very affluent area. And in fact, it happened in Nancy Pelosi's own district. So San Francisco doesn't have that echo chamber problem. And again, the San Francisco Chronicle is within that echo chamber and they're sounding the alarm.
So
This
where
is
how
not
does this all play out? That's what we want. Lopkin's analysis. What's going on is what's going on. The interesting part is there ramifications, if any?
short term. Unfortunately, I don't think there are any ramifications. I think people are indoctrinated. But I heard an analysis a few nights ago by Geraldo Rivera, and he's actually very liberal, and
Mm-hmm.
he actually suggested that we let these cities die so that then they'll have to rebuild.
Well, something. Geraldo is an old Democrat in terms of I know chronologically he is, but also in
Well,
his
yeah, I mean, he's
mindset.
80.
Yeah, I got it. But no,
Yeah.
he's representative of a bygone era. You always talk about moderate Democrats.
Yeah.
He was one of them. Yeah, socially, you do your own thing, whatever. But he had common sense. You look at some of these other Democrats like AOC. I mean, They're Meshuggah. They're crazy.
Well,
So he is
you
a
know what I
dying
think.
breed, is my
You,
point.
you know what I think the difference between the older Democrats like Geraldo and the younger Democrats like AOC is? When Geraldo went to school, you had to learn civics. You had to learn how government works. They don't teach that anymore. AOC went through her entire educational career without ever learning what an executive order is. This is why she keeps yelling for Biden to do executive orders that are illegal because she
Well,
doesn't
but I have to ask you a
understand.
question on that. How how does Boston University keep its accreditation after graduating AOC? I think she had a degree in economics. How
Yeah,
hysterical is that?
she had a degree in economics and doesn't understand how the economy works.
Well, maybe she
And
does. She got rid of Amazon
yeah,
and maybe 20,000 great jobs.
yeah, but I mean, Boston University's accreditation is part of the problem because what you have now, especially in higher education, but you're also seeing it in K through 12 now, is you have what I've heard referred to as the educational cabal. And this is the incredibly woke teaching institutions where they're teaching that, this is where they're getting teachers accredited, and they're basically in bed with Randy Weingartner and the teachers union. So you have teachers that are not really being taught to teach, they're being taught to indoctrinate. And higher education, you have to go with the tenure and you have to kowtow to these unions. And now
Okay, let
you're
me
seeing it
interject
in K
something
through
because you have a
12.
great, Dr. Lafferty, you have an amazingly great point. If you're a teacher and you're 2 years away from your tenure, there's no way you're going to fight, even if you don't believe in this shit. There's no, and you're not going to flunk certain groups of people. It's just not going to happen. Sorry, true.
Well, now you're not flunking anybody.
Oh yeah, no, everyone get yeah.
We just heard that from the Chicago mayor elect, who is work, in the pocket of the Chicago teachers union. He was talking about, he was a teacher, and he said he does not believe in giving F's. It's like, no, no, no. When somebody fails, you need to fail them.
Well, I think
Because
it's really funny that Michael Savage years ago was commenting on, I don't know, some football player, one of the big Nebraska or whatever. I was up on criminal charges. I love what he says. He goes, everyone's a college boy, meaning college. See that? Sorry, that to me, college is a new high school. It's a joke.
Well, I mean, the problem is we're not teaching kids what they need to know in K through 12. This is why we saw the problem in University of California, started at UCal Berkeley, where they decided that California students were spending too much time having to do remedial courses, so they lowered the standards. And
Well,
this
it's even
is
true in business. They have to re-educate. Corporate training's a hot profession because they're getting out of college and these kids don't know how to write. They don't know how to critically think.
Yeah, LinkedIn has actually done several surveys of businesses. And the one thing that students are not being taught, and it's the biggest lack when they go into the workforce, is communications.
Oh, and that gets to the bigger issue that you articulated is I think that there's going to be a real sea change if it's not happening already in higher education because I think your buffet analogy is 100% correct. And I've talked to other people about that theory that I think if I was an employer, I would find it more appealing for a young person who's got a certification in this, a accreditation in this. In other words, got the skills that I'm looking for. I don't know. I used to be totally 1,000% on board with. In fact, I used to look down on people who didn't have a college degree. That's completely changed. I rather have someone that took the initiative, got the skills that are required, and going like STEM certifications, what have you. Am I wrong? And
And
then forget about my opinion, but do you think
no,
you're in the
you're
business world? Do you think more and more employers are thinking that
They are, and it's been going on for quite a while. When I look at now, I do business coaching and consulting. You would think that I would want MBAs working for me. MBAs are actually the last people I want to hire. I want to hire people that have engineering knowledge, that have science knowledge, and that have a strong sense of language, because these are the actual skills that are needed. I want people who can do math and accounting. You know, I don't care if you've got an MBA. In fact, I would rather somebody who's hungry with a high school diploma than somebody who, well, I don't really want to do that much, but they've got an MBA. It's the
way? Well, can I
skills that
interject
are
something
important.
about an MBA, which I do have? I had a friend in New York. He worked in advertising. He was not a college grad, but very smart. Said, beware of the unintended consequences of an MBA. And I think it's done more harm
Oh,
in the
yes.
business world than good. And let me get right to the chase. They will take the, the simplest concept, I'm talking the MBA mentality, and make it rocket science, trying to quantify everything. And to give you a real world example, I worked for Stanley Black and Decker. You cannot get any better brand name. Stanley was a top 10 brand name. So they got the MBAs in there, and believe it or not, Stanley's actually in huge trouble. I mean, real trouble, no joke. They no brand they're getting their lunch eaten by smaller, more, if you will, traditional companies that actually understand the business, understand, the tool and the hardware business, and all the MBAs, all this bullshit about, what's the throughput and, all this shit, that doesn't mean a damn thing, are getting their lunch handed to you. Your comment? Do you see that in the business world as
I've
well?
I've seen it for a long time, and I think we really are at a tipping point because MBA programs are starting to see fewer people enrolling.
Yeah,
But
it's a
in
joke.
terms of business, back in the late 90s, I had MBAs. This is before I started my business. I was actually working at a .com startup, and I had an MBA working for me. And I would be doing things, and he would go, "Oh, so you're going to do XYZ." And basically, he had his MBA. I just had a bachelor's in communications. But the only difference in the knowledge we had is that mine was applied knowledge. I learned it on the ground, actually doing the work. So I was able to come up with solutions faster than he did. But because he had an MBA, he had a name for what I was doing. That was the
Exactly,
big
yes.
difference.
There you go, 100%.
You
Well, moving on, maybe this is not an unintended consequences of an MBA, but it's maybe the intended or unintended consequences of a moron. And that is California's on the brink of financial collapse, but yet there's more and more buzz as Biden delays his announcement of Gavin Newsom throwing his hat in the ring. If he gets elected, then it's the end. Check, please, for
yeah,
America.
Gavin
And I think
Newsom
we're
as
dumb enough to elect him. Oh, he's so
Gavin
good looking.
But Gavin Newsom, as mayor of San Francisco, destroyed one of the great cities of this country. He
Yes.
then got became governor of California and destroyed California. Can he be elected president? Yes, because as I mentioned before, you've got more and more people who are voting just on the issue of abortion, and they're not even looking at the fact that California, never mind the fact that their energy grid can't handle their needs. Never mind the fact that they have a massive deficit after a surplus because of a federal government bailout of the state. You have a shortage of U-Hauls because people are moving out of the state. And this is the idiot that the Democrats have as the front runner. Because if Biden does not run, Newsom is polling better than Kamala Harris. Not
Well,
necessarily
my
surprising.
cat
Yeah.
Carl, who might be in the background, you might hear him from time to time, since I'm not doing this for my usual uh, bunker. Yes, and I think he could actually win because you've nailed it. It's all about emotion. He can talk about fairness. He can talk about
The
equity, all the soft things that the morons, and they'll back it up on TikTok, and he could actually win.
Now I think because of Newsom's track record, and that's something important to remember, that unlike Biden in the Senate and Harris, Newsom actually has a track record that he would have to defend. I think, first of all, no Republican's going to vote for Newsom. That's a given. I think he's going to have a very difficult time holding on to independence. So I think he's going to have a bigger uphill battle than most Democrats would. Because if somebody's a governor, they've actually got to, you can see what happened to their state, rather than a congressperson or a senator where their decision, the ramifications of what they've done isn't as clear. It's a lot more nebulous. They can skirt things, again, like Biden did. I think
A hundred
Newsom's going to
percent
have a
agree.
bigger problem.
And speaking of the Biden issue, he's delaying his announcement, some say, because he wants to time it with yet another indictment of Trump. But Trump was on Tucker Carlson last night, and he basically said he's going to run even if he's convicted. But on the bigger issue, I agree with Trump on this one, and I actually YouTubed it. He was talking about that he doesn't think Biden is going to run because he basically said there's something wrong with this guy, and he talked about the interview with Al Roker, who's about his puffball. I mean, his biggest question is like, is Colonel Clown going to the Easter hunt? But anyway, he interviewed Biden, and it's scary. I encourage all our listeners to go YouTube it. It's Al Roker and Joe Biden. They're talking about the Easter egg hunt on front of the White House lawn. So Biden has to have Dr. Jill Biden, next to him, and he literally, it's shocking. It's funny, but it's not funny. He's incoherent. Like he's so out there. It's not even funny. Have you seen it? And there's no way he can hold up. It's not COVID anymore. He can't hide in a basement. And I also say, even though he was like mush brain back in 2020, that he's exponentially worse now. He's incapable of having a coherent thought. He was talking about eggs rolling around on the space station. It was like, whoa, dude. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he is getting cognitively worse. There's no doubt about this. And I mean, this is something we've talked about for years. My sources in the Democratic State Committee of Florida at the time, when Joe Biden announced he was running in 2020, they told me they knew he had dementia. So this is not, and of course, that story got out and they went, oh, it's Russian disinformation. No, it's not Russian disinformation. His own people know it. That's why he doesn't give press conferences. He is now in Ireland, and it is the first time a president has gone to a foreign country and not given a press conference. And they announced he's not going to take questions. He's not going to do a press conference. And honestly, I believe it's because his handlers are terrified of what he's going to say. Because every time he does take questions, the White House goes into crisis mode. Going, well, that's not what he meant. That's not our policy.
I agree with you, Dr. Lopkin, but it was before, it was bad. There's no question. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I think it's so scary now that our listeners, you may or may not have any idea. I think he before he would take some questions on an aside, whatever. I think he's now incapable of almost any kind of normal cognitive functioning. If you saw the interview with Al Roker, it's downright chilling. And I think he couldn't act. There's no way. And so I'll ask you, because I always say, then what's the ramification? How does this play out? I mean, he can't hide I don't see how this works. Tell me, help me out. I mean, a year from now, he's going to
Uh,
go another year without. How's he going to campaign? How's he going to even do anything? And if you had a press, it would already be gone. But we don't have a press.
yeah, I mean the press has been hiding this, and I'm actually going to go out on a limb here saying this is nothing new because going you can go all the way back to the 1930s and 40s because the press was working with then President Franklin Roosevelt. The bulk of the country had no idea he was in a wheelchair. They had no idea he had polio. So this is long-standing
And
tradition
people
to
had no
cover up.
idea that JFK was a philanderer of the first magnitude.
All right, but that's a lot easier to hide than polio and dementia
Oh,
is.
okay, but
You know,
here's the difference. Here's the difference. I think they did it for patriotic reasons. I'm being honest. Yeah, of course, there's some obviously liberal bias, but the situation of FDR in a wheelchair or not, he was mentally capable. It really had no
yes.
effect on his presidency. This guy is out. He's gone. It's not like this is not. I know I'm partisan, but this guy is gone. And I think if the press was doing their job and they were actually patriotic, I'm not talking about being partisan. I'm talking about patriotic. They would show what America, the hands that we're in, meaning our leadership with Joe Biden. And if that doesn't scare the shit out of anyone, then I don't know what to tell you.
Well, but here's the conundrum that the press has to face. Does the public's right to know about Biden's condition supersede the effect that that would have? Now, I mean, let's take a look at America on the global stage. Just this week, you had French President Macron saying Europe shouldn't be following America's lead on Taiwan. You've got, because it's so evident that Biden is a weak leader, you have China doing military exercises simulating an attack on Taiwan. You've got Russia invading Ukraine. Now, what happens if the press actually reports and confirms that Biden is not in his right mind? What does that do? That emboldens our adversaries. And
But
the
they already
big,
know it. They know. In other words, they got they have their intelligence services. Yeah, it would exasperate the situation,
it would
but
exasperate it. But here's the bigger problem. Let's assume, and again, I said my sources in the Democratic Party told me he had dementia when he announced he was running. There was widespread speculation that they were going to run him. They knew he wasn't capable, so they were going to use the 25th Amendment to remove him and put Kamala Harris in office. However, Kamala surprised everybody because nobody realized just how incompetent she was. So now, even if they do report on it, there's nothing we can do
there's no wiggle
other
room. Very good point. Yes,
other
there's no
than
way out.
voting against him in 2024.
Well stated. Yes, they're up against a rock and a hard place because of their allegiance or misguided allegiance to the liberal Democratic Party versus being patriotic, which the press at one time was. The press, you could actually tell them back in the day, don't report this for right now because there's national security, because they had some degree of patriotism. Those days are over.
Well,
But
but
speaking,
in
go ahead.
all fairness, though, that is not limited to the press. We just saw a survey come out in the past week that I believe it was 68 or 69% of Americans don't believe patriotism is important anymore. And I
Uh,
honestly think this is because our leaders have gone off the rails on both sides of the aisle. And it goes back to an old quote by Mark Twain. and I'm going to butcher it because I can't think of the exact quote off the top of my head, but it was something like, you should always be, loyal to your something like, loyalty to your country is something you owe the country, but loyalty to the government is something that the government has to earn. And our government hasn't earned that in 16 years at least.
That is the point. Because your blind patriotism is not exactly, maybe not like Twain said, maybe not warranted. You've never had a country, the United States, that was at the top of its game 60, 70 years. That's not that long ago in, human history, and to run it into the ground. So what are people going to be patriotic about? I mean, you have numbnuts in the White House. You had the Trump debacle. It's just been one continuous failure after another. Everyone knows America's in decline, unless you're just on TikTok all day.
Yeah, it is absolutely ridiculous. Oh, here, okay, I just looked up. The exact quote is, loyalty to the country always, loyalty to the government when it deserves it. And this is
Well, we
Mark,
don't deserve it.
yeah, this is Mark Twain. So this goes back centuries now. But it's true. We have not had a government that deserved our loyalty. And I'll go back and say, I think honestly the last president, government that actually deserved our patriotism and our loyalty was probably George H.W. Bush.
You are probably correct. He got screwed, by the way, but that's another issue by what's the guy who ran as an independent, whatever the hell's name is. But yes,
Ross Perot.
yeah, but he was yeah, and how about the press calling him a wimp? Yeah, go fly a plane on an aircraft carrier and tell me how at 17 years old and tell me about being a wimp. But that's
Yeah,
another
this
issue.
guy was jumping out of airplanes when he was in his 90s. There was nothing about George H.W. Bush that was a wimp. But
Yeah, it's funny. They hated him back then, but because of the anti-Trump fervor, when he died, he was a great man. Yes, okay,
yeah,
they couldn't piss on him enough when he was president, but that's another issue. Speaking though of Biden, or continuing our discussion on Biden and his weakness and incompetency, and the national security link, and part of what came out is first of all, you have complete incom Blinken and the other moron. I have no faith in them, and actually in very precarious times, I get a little worried about my security, literally and figuratively, being in their hands. But the leak indicated that the United Arab Emirates and Egypt were selling or delivering missiles to Russia. Why is that important? Two issues. First of all, we support like Pakistan. Like really, really, okay. So you got to choose who you're supporting. But number two, it's a blatant disregard and disrespect for the current administration. It's just like pissing on them. It's like who even cares what they think? They would never have done that under Trump. Never would have done it to George H.W. Bush. I can tell you that much.
it
Correct?
really is ridiculous what's going on. And this is a major problem with our foreign policy, is that we are literally borrowing money from China to to pay these countries and give aid to these countries, who are then turning around and using that money to aid our enemies. I mean,
Go figure.
what stupidity is this? We have to seriously reevaluate who we are giving aid to.
Well, again, we don't know the answer to that because I think the people into the bureaucracy, it's just there's no people with any kind of decision making ability. It's just the norm. Like Trump said, the swamp, rubber stamping the same stupid shit over and over again, and that's as simple as it is.
Yeah, we what we need to do, and of course they'll never do it. Although I have heard a couple of Republicans now pushing this idea in business, there is a process called zero-based budgeting. And what this is what most people do when they budget is they take last year's budget and they go, well, we still need this. But now with inflation, we're going to need X amount more than this. And that's how they do a budget. Zero based budgeting is you start every line item at zero and you actually calculate what you need in that budget. It is an amazing way to keep budgets from inflating, and it focuses you on trying to figure out what is actually working. But of course, the government doesn't want that because the government wants to give money to as many places as possible to buy loyalty. Why? Because,
Without
as we just said, loyalty to the country, always loyalty to the government when they deserve it.
exactly, and on the final theme of incompetency, you have increasing saber rattling with Taiwan and China. I don't think it's if. I think it's when that comes to a conclusion with China either militarily or through other means seizing what they think is their part of their own country. And I think, and I like your comments, if and when that happens, that will be the official moment of the passing of the torch, or who's in charge, who's the king, and the torch is going to be passed from the U.S. to China. And I think the world will take notice.
I think the world is already taking notice. I'm not sure if that's going to be the actual tipping point. It depends on the response. And but quite frankly, there are two possible outcomes of that, neither one of which is good. The first outcome is the one that you just described, where it is the tipping point and it becomes the passing of the torch where America's best days are behind us. Um,
Which I believe already
the,
happened.
well, yes. The second possibility, and quite frankly, this is one that scares me more because whether it's a coordinated attack or separate attacks, that could be the tipping point that literally puts us into World War III. Take a look at what has gone on in just the past week. You had China doing the military exercises, simulating an attack on Taiwan, and announcing that they are ready to fight. You had attacks on Israel from within Lebanon and Syria because of Hamas. You have Russia, despite calls for an Easter truce, increasing their attacks on Ukraine, and you had information leak that Ukraine may not have enough anti aircraft weapons to get past May, which means Russia will be able to increase their air attacks on Ukraine. All of this going on at the same time. Plus, you have America in a much weakened state because Joe Biden, never mind his leadership problems, last year depleted our strategic oil reserves so that he could lower the price of gas before the 2022 election. So we don't even have the resources. If all of that goes on, if the Middle East erupts into a war, if China erupts into a conflict in Taiwan, if Ukraine increases, we don't even have the resources right now to keep our own way of life going.
Oh,
We could literally see an oil crisis that we haven't seen since the 70s. We could see food shortages that we haven't seen since World War II.
well, I blame the press. I'm sorry, it sounds simplistic. Because of them and their lack of due diligence, you and all the lies about Trump and all this other stuff, They now we're left with no one in charge. You don't even have a functioning vice president. You have a valley girl as vice president, the cackler in chief, and you have numbnuts. So who's in charge? Help me out.
Honestly, I don't think anybody's in charge. And the reason I say that is the report that the White House just released about what happened in Afghanistan. And you had the Pentagon spokesperson taking a question about how he could say nothing went wrong when everything was in chaos. Now, we all saw the footage, we saw the chaos live on television. And he actually said, well, I don't see any chaos. Really? You had
Well,
the military telling Biden what was going to happen, Biden ignoring it, and the military doing nothing. And you've had this time after time where the people that actually know what's going to go on are saying it. They're saying it to Congress under oath, and yet nobody is paying attention. I don't think anybody's in charge anymore.
well, let's leave on that happy note, Dr. Loppin. Little dark podcast, but a good one anyway. And well, I know that our listeners can give their input, can't they, Dr. Lopkin?
They can. And with everything going on, we'd love to hear what you think about the state of the country and the issues that we're talking about. Go to exvadio.com. That's exvadio.com/connect. And let us know what you think. And of course, while you're there, you can listen to back episodes of Carnivore Bites as well as the rest of the Xvadio podcast network at xvadio.com/podcasts, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Audible, and other platforms that respect freedom of speech.
I thank you very much, Dr. Loppin. Great insights. And I'll see you and our listeners next week.
We'll see you then.